So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shannon Olson, and I'm director of the ECHO Network, and welcome to our third Q&A session on India's journey beyond COVID-19. I want to thank all of you for joining us in this very difficult time as we're still very much grappling with this crisis. So thank you very much, first of all. And as with the two previous sessions, I'd like to start, for those of you who haven't been able to join us yet, by explaining a bit what our purpose is. So the ECHO Network is a social innovation partnership steered by the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. And ECHO is intended to unite citizens, government, NGOs, academia, and industry to tackle real-world problems in human and environmental ecosystems through interdisciplinary collaborations and scientific research. And in order to do this, we need to first try to understand what are the current issues that we are facing here in India, and then come up with specific methods and ways for how scientific research can address them. So to this end, we've already started working with a unique group of economists, healthcare professionals, lawyers, scholars, policymakers, activist journalists, and CEOs to share with us how they feel science and technology can play a role in India's future. Through this effort, we established a white paper called India's Journey Beyond COVID-19 that you can read on our website, www.econetwork.in. And this white paper has actually been intending to start conversations with the broader community. And that's the purpose of our efforts today, as we want to start these conversations with you. And we hope that you yourself will go back to your communities and have these conversations with each other as well on how science and technology can take us forward. And we hope you'll continue to interact with us, and please send us emails, follow us on social media, and communicate with us your thoughts. We're really interested in hearing from you, because that's the way that the ECHO Network, that's what its name means, is that we're science that listens. So there is going to be time during this session for you to also raise your voice and ask some questions. If you're familiar with the Zoom platform, you can see that there's a Q&A box down at the bottom where you can raise various questions throughout this session. Depending on the number of questions, we may not be able to get to all of them before the session ends. So if there's a question that you already see that's been asked that's very similar to yours, or something you're very interested in, please give it a like, a thumbs up, and the most upvoted questions will be the ones we'll end up taking first at the end of the session. So today's session in particular deals with a topic very close to my heart as a chemical ecologist, and also the experts today are also very close to my heart. One is a pretty new friend and inspiration that I've just gotten to know through this white paper, and the other has been a guiding light to me since I began my career at NCBS. So I'll start by introducing these two wonderful people. Prerna Singh Bindra has been working to conserve India's wildlife for 15 years. She is a member of India's National Board for Wildlife and has been part of its core standing committee in 2010 to 2013. Her work has contributed to creating new protected areas in India, and she's very widely published in journalism, and she's also authored a wonderful, wonderful book called The Vanishing India's Wildlife Crisis, and also she's co-edited Wild Treasures, Reflections on Natural World Heritage Sites in Asia, published by the Wildlife Institute of India in 2019. So Prerna, thank you so much for being with us. Please turn your camera on so that we can see you.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and likewise, it's been such a pleasure to be part of this and to know you.
Fantastic. And our other expert that we're having today is Uma Ramakrishnan. She's an associate professor at NCBS, where I'm also a professor as well. And she is also a Wellcome Trust India Alliance Senior Fellow. And she spent the last 15 years studying wildlife, biodiversity, and conservation through the lens of genetics. So she and her colleagues have worked on the connectivity between tiger reserves, the impacts of population isolation and inbreeding on tiger populations and other mammals as well, and trying to understand why biodiversity is so high in places like the Western Ghats of India. Recently, she has been investigating emerging infectious diseases, for which she has been very, very popular during this pandemic. And we're very happy to have her with us, considering how busy she has been. And Uma is a great friend to me and an inspiration, and has been my mentor since I started at NCS. So thank you, Uma, for joining with us today. You're muted.
Thanks for that introduction, and really happy to be here and to be with you and Prerna here today.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you both. It's really wonderful to have an all-women session, especially with such amazing women as yourself. So I'll start with the questions, and as we always have started in our sessions to this point, I'll actually start by trying to get a little bit of sense of why you're here, what motivated you to be part of this effort, both today, but in the broader cause of being part of our consortium. So Prerna, why don't you start?
So thanks for that, and Uma, delighted to be on this panel with you as well. And so my life's purpose, so to speak, has been to mainstream conservation, to drive home the point that conservation is not in a little box, environment is not in a little box, unrelated to health or economy or social concerns. And I found because without environment security, without a clean, healthy environment, without ecological integrity, we will not progress. We won't have development. Our country won't move forward. And any environment conservation, protection of environment has to be a science-driven effort, has to be knowledge-based. While, we all are here because our hearts are in it. I mean, there's no questioning that. But I found the Eco Network to be this great, exciting, innovative platform, which, social innovative platform, which is a multidisciplinary network, as well as a partnership between organizations, governments, institutions, NGOs, professionals. So yeah, it's been a very exciting journey, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I think it's been so to be with professionals who understand. We all come from different disciplines, but surprisingly, and not so surprisingly, we shared a lot of common ground with. So yeah.
Absolutely, and we're honored to have you as well, Prerna. So how about you, Uma? What is your motivation?
So I echo Prerna's thoughts. I mean, I think it's been really wonderful to be a part of this multidisciplinary platform and to find that coherence in terms of the synergy, in terms of what everyone from very different walks of life feels about the way forward. And the fact that everybody agrees that the way forward must be different, right? I think that itself is something to really stop and think about. And so that's what's been really nice about this white paper, is that, it's important for us to not just rush on, but to stop and think about the future. Personally, I've always been, I think communication is really important. It's something which we must do. I mean, ultimately, we are, as academics in a publicly funded institution, it should be something we really take very seriously to communicate and communicate the excitement of science and the fact that, scientific thinking can help us maybe grapple with problems of the future. I hope that's how we will all think.
Absolutely, and it's been for us also a pleasure, because both of you, as well as the others that we've been working with, are such good listeners, right? Which is a thing we forget about communication, that it also involves a lot of listening to each other. And so I'm really pleased to work with both of you on this. So Uma, I'd like to actually start by asking you a question that was brought up by Chapudira Kushalapa, and he's the Dean of Forestry at UAS Shivamoga. And he wants to know if you could provide some examples of research outcomes that facilitate ecosystem conservation in India. So how research can actually lead to conservation ultimately, especially in the Indian context.
So that's a great question. And, I was pondering that. I mean, I think that unfortunately, the studies on ecosystems in India, the scientific investigation of ecosystem is relatively poor. and we don't unfortunately know a lot about Indian ecosystems, to the extent that we don't sometimes even know what our ecosystems are, what our biomes are. So, for example, work by Jai Sri Ratnam and others on Indian savannas, kind of opening our eyes to what we actually have as our ecosystems instead of calling everything a forest. Or also work on grasslands and how they should be given equal importance, or whatever. So basically, we do tend to have um, a, a narrative which is dominated by forests. And so in terms of the science, understanding better what our ecosystems are and what our biomes are is the first step, right? The second step is how can that information, how can that knowledge, that basic research, understanding interactions, drivers, and so on, help us to manage and conserve these systems. And maybe we're not yet there. I think that's a little bit of a ways away. Another example is invasive species. We have many invasive species in many of our protected areas. How are they affecting our ecosystems? We're still we still don't know enough for us to possibly jump into using these science influences for management. But I'm hoping that this is something which will happen more and more. The second component which is missing, besides just the information, is the fact that that link between managers and scientists doesn't happen all the time. And that's, again, a place where communication comes in. So it's really important for us to do the science, but also figure out a way to talk, as common stakeholders. Managers and scientists are interested in the future of these landscapes. So how can we work together with them to bring these principles or knowledge and learnings to management is kind of the second step. So yeah, so basically to break it down, we need more knowledge, and it seems like scientists are always saying that. But I think definitely, like for example, if you were asking me, how has science helped with the conservation of species? I think there's many examples of that in India, right? In fact, our tiger census is now in the Guinness Book of World Records. You may have seen that in the paper. So, I mean, I think there's many examples of that. But for ecosystem science and the study of ecosystems still has a little way to go. But I'm sure those interactions and those applications to management will be soon coming.
So I'd like to stay with you for a minute, because there's a related question to this research that you're talking about and the need for more scientific research in India on our ecosystems. And that's actually by Chavi Batla, who's part of the Bharat Rural Livelihoods Foundation. And she wants to know, how we can say that scientific methods don't have long-term consequences on ecological processes. So, I mean, do you agree with that, or what is your feeling about that?
So, I mean, I think that, anything you do in an ecosystem could potentially have a consequence, right? Whether it's an experiment, a vegetation experiment, whether it is a warming experiment, whether it's a study on animals and biodiversity. And so the thing is that, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be done. So I think that most institutions have, regulatory boards, which basically, whenever you're proposing a study, for example, if I'm proposing a study on, the spread of infection by small mammals, I would have to necessarily catch and sometimes sacrifice those small mammals, right? Because otherwise I cannot study them. I cannot study, say, what proportion of rodents carry Bartonella or Rickettsia bacterial infections. So the thing is, then I have to go through the required permission process and the required ethical process, not just permission to be in a space, but ethical guidelines have to be followed. And I think that as long as those are, well enforced, I think that's something which we have to, science does sometimes require those sacrifices. That said, I think many studies have shown all over the world, there's been a lot of debate about this with respect to museum collections, that the number of animals, say, taken for a museum collection is really small, and many of these species have very high growth rates, so they shouldn't affect their extinction or something like that. They shouldn't go extinct. And finally, I think researchers are very sensitive, and they are always trying to find newer non-invasive methods to conduct research. I think Prerna would like to add something.
Yes, please go ahead, Prerna.
No, I wouldn't, because I think you have answered it very well, Uma. I would just perhaps add a bit on the first point, which I think it's so very critical that other ecosystems and that science-based studies are done, ecological studies are done to emphasize the importance of grasslands, wetlands. I was reading that there is a plan to make Chambal ravines arable. And I was, oh my God, these are such critical ecosystems. How can we do advocacy to conserve this? And therefore, that's where the science comes in. So, you know, the importance of science, therefore, cannot be understated. And I agree with her, the ethical rules are very, very strong. So besides the conscience, I think all researchers are very, so I'd just like to echo what Uma said actually, and just like to emphasize it a bit more, amplify it if I may.
So Prerna, with this premise that this research is really, really important, Madhu Verma, who's the chief economist at WRI, has a question about how can we reconcile environmental conservation and these developmental targets that we all strive to reach. So, and maybe you can link in how research and other efforts that we need to take can contribute to that.
That's a tough one. And I think Dr. Madhu Verma, who perhaps can answer this question as better than me, but I'm glad she's asked it. You know, I found this is a huge debate, development versus environment. And it frankly foxes me, because there can be no development without environment, because it just undermines, if you don't have a safe environment, it just undermines everything, public health, environment, and nothing shows that better than the situation we find ourselves in, because COVID-19 is just one of the many zoonotic diseases that are there because of destruction of nature, as well as illegal wildlife trade, which brings us in close proximity to wildlife. And of course, Uma's better qualified to answer that. But I'm just saying this to stress that there is no debate, and unless we have ecological security, we won't have development, let alone development. You know, it puts it's important for our sustenance. So I think the way forward, and we don't have a balance. I also am very uncomfortable with the word balance, because when you say it's a hurdle, if you look at just a simple thing of regulations, because a project needs to go through environment, forest and wildlife regulations. And if you look at the approvals given by these on these grounds to projects, we have a rejection rate which is lower than 1%. So 99% of projects, be they in sanctuaries or be they very polluting industries or cut through the most pristine of forests, are allowed. So there isn't a balance. And I think the answer is again to recognize that environment is part of right from the planning stage. So when you plan a project, or when you plan the environment factor must be factored in. Social concerns, environment concerns, ecological concerns need to be factored in. Science needs to come in where you weigh in what are the ecological costs of this? What are the economic costs? Is this road, how much, you know, what's the economic value it's going to give us? What are the ecological costs? Will it lead to landslides? Every such project needs to have these studies, and only I think that is the way forward. We need to value nature, and while yes, economically, but in every which way, because I only see mainstreaming ecological concerns is the way forward. I think that's what I would like to say.
So one of the places where it's very difficult to do this mainstreaming is actually in our urban areas, right? Because we have so much development and landfills and other issues. And so Nazreen Khan, who's at enewsroom.in, wants to know how do we actually improve conservation in our highly populated urban areas of India, and not simply just in our forests and our, let's say, more rural areas, but also in our urban areas where, as you say, ecology and nature is also still very, very important.
You know, a lot of these questions are like, how do we improve environment? How do we improve forest areas? And we first need to preserve what we have. We don't have to talk about greening, because you cannot replace ecosystems. So if your government, or if your, if the municipality or whoever the actors develop the agency might be, is trying to say that we can transplant these trees, you need to start questioning that. And in urban areas, so conserving our ecosystems are so important because we're living in a hellhole. I live in Gurgaon, which is part of Delhi NCR, which is one of the most polluted cities in the world. And India has 13 out of 20 of the most polluted cities. Bangalore is where Uma is based, is running out of water, right? And most of our cities are. And so I cannot overstate the importance of conserving the ecosystems we have, whether they be lakes, whether they be the forests that we have. So I think as a normal citizen, as well as a scientist or a journalist or a teacher, whatever you might be, conserve to save what is there in your city. I mean, we are here in the Aravallis and we have an ongoing battle to save the wetland next door, to save the Aravallis, to save the Mangerbani, which is just one small pocket of the original Aravallis. So I think because without them, I mean, we know there will be more dust storms in Delhi if we lose that protective shield. So there won't be there will be water issues, and by 2050, more Indians will be in cities than in villages. We used to say India lives in its villages, but that's going to change. And our smart cities must also be ecologically smart. Unfortunately, they don't have an element of ecology. And that, I think, at a planning level, we really need to change that. Each city has to be ecologically smart. And there are excellent. We have excellent green areas. And Bombay has Sanjay Gandhi National Park. Bangalore has Bannerghatta and lakes, and Delhi has the Ridge. So all cities have, and even if you look abroad, London is now promoting itself as a national park city. So why don't we take pride in what we have? I think that is, we need to, and we have so much, we are, so I think we just need to also get that culture ethic. We already do revere nature. So whether it be, in the forests or in the grasslands or wherever it is, we need to rekindle that ethic that we have, the nature ethic.
Absolutely. That's why I came all the way from upstate New York to work in India, is because of exactly those places you mentioned. It's a phenomenal ecosystems we have in this country. So there's a lot of ways of engaging in conservation. You said we need to start by preserving what we have and conserving what we have. And one of those ways that's been talked about a lot, and it's been a big kind of buzzword, is fortress conservation. And Charlie Batla, again, from BRLF, she actually wants to know if fortress conservation is better for wildlife. Maybe Uma, you can start, and then Prerna, you can also address this question, because I know you both have a lot of experience with it. So
okay. Yeah, thanks, Shannon. That is a very controversial question. So I mean, if taken very literally, the word fortress would mean something which is fenced, which is, no in and out. And I can tell you from some work we did on connectivity, modeling connectivity for tigers, that in central Indian landscapes, which is actually a very well-connected landscape overall, that if you fence these protected areas, very few of them survive 50 years or 100 years into the future. And that's because all of our protected areas are really small. If you put all of India's protected areas together, they are 3 times the size of Kruger, which is one park in South Africa. So our protected areas are really small. And for these large species like, say, tigers or elephants to subsist, they must be this free-flowing animals between protected areas. Colonization of areas is the only way these larger landscapes will sustain in the future. So as a fortress, it's not even an option biologically, right? We can't have such small areas fenced off. Now, the second question is about people inside protected areas versus not. And there's a lot of debate about that. On one end of the spectrum, people will say, why have protected areas at all? I'm not there. I think we do need protected areas. We must have protected areas. What I would like is to expand those protected areas to landscapes where we have restoration, ecosystem services, people and wildlife, hopefully coexisting. Sometimes there are mishaps, which always will happen. But with the high level of tolerance and the love for wildlife we have in India, maybe it's a possibility, at least we hope, or at least it has to be managed in some way that it's not really having a very detrimental impact on people's lives. So I guess, we do need protected areas. We cannot simply fence them. We cannot afford to do that in India because they're simply too small. But some model where we expand space for nature and space for people would be really nice if possible. I'm going out on a limb, but that's what I think.
I think I'll go on an extra limb here. I am completely with you on the wildlife part, both actually, but on the wildlife part, I actually have an ongoing case in the Supreme Court, which says that we cannot fence national parks, protected areas, and thereby stop the movement of elephants, because they are by nature a migratory species. All wildlife is, most wildlife is, I won't go in. So definitely for wildlife, it doesn't work. Our PAs are too small. At PAs, we have 5% of India's protected areas, about 5%, which is against a global average of about 10 to 11%. So we are way less. Plus, if we look at effective land area, it's just about 2%. And this is just terrestrial. So just about 2% because we have all kinds of infrastructure, etc. within these PAs. So these are very, very critical as a refuge for wildlife. And we simply cannot afford to stress them further. So Fortis, as far as do we not allow people inside, I think that is what is the angst against, but no protected areas is simply not an option. We do need these areas so that the land use does not change drastically in terms of infrastructure, large infrastructure. And wildlife, which is wide-ranging, and predators and tigers and bears, elephants, they do need at least some undisturbed areas, and science supports it. I expand, and there are people, like, this is very controversial, but there are people who are actually wanting to relocate. I did my master's thesis on it, and I've been studying it for 10 years as a conservationist. There is no room for eviction, but if people want to move out of protected areas because they live a terrible life inside, it's very, very hard to live inside remote forests without access to facilities, they should be supported. And in the most just, fair, informed, incentivized, empathetic manner possible. And then we need, it has to be a matrix. Some protected areas, core breeding habitat, some where people and nature coexist, especially if there are fewer, elephants are a problem to live with, much as I love them because they're my favorite animals, but they don't make for very good neighbors, especially so, we have to work out various systems, some places community reserves, some places eco-sensitive zones where your kind of industry and land use is regulated. So I think we need a very nuanced, site-specific answer to this. It cannot be, we need why forest conservation? No, each country is different. Forget country, each site is different. And we have to be sensitive to people, because without them, if they are not for conservation, we won't go anywhere. If we do them, so yeah, that's a long answer to the question.
But I liked what you said about, the need to not only respect nature, but also respect the people who have to live in that nature and with that nature. And so a question, because you've mentioned that you've also been involved in policies and also developing protected areas themselves, is do you feel that our policies are still focusing to protect nature from humans, or do you think we're starting to change to actually protect nature for humans? Or do you think that's the right way of thinking at all? And I like this question because it's very thought-provoking, and it's by Arkajoti Shom. He's a graduate student at Nalanda University. So I'd like you to follow up with that.
I would like Uma's comments also on it, but what I think, see, obviously, the biggest threat to nature is our activities, our actions, the way we keep expanding. And so yes, all our laws, I don't think they were framed, oh my God, we have to protect nature from humans, but they arose out of a need that nature was being destroyed. I don't know if we have recognized largely whether what was it that protecting nature for us. But in thinking, definitely there has been a change. We are recognizing the value of nature, not just globally. I mean, there was what was the report? IP, the biodiversity, so the value of biodiversity. Yeah, which showed how critical it is, and not just monetarily, but in the various ecosystem services it provides. Madhu Verma, who's here in the audience, has done a study on the economic valuation of tiger reserves. So we are, and it takes into account all kinds with carbon sequestration, everything. So there is definitely a shift in thinking. I don't think it has actually translated into changes in policy. There was a thinking that we should have a green GDP. That concept was started where you take in the environment costs of the degradation, environment degradation, etc., of development activities, etc., of our growth. It's still somewhere that started in 2011, but I think these are very positive things that we're actually recognizing the value of nature and saving nature for ourselves and hopefully nature for nature. So, yeah, that's what I think.
Uma, would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I think that's, I think there's no doubt that nature for its own sake is something which must subsist. We are, after all, just one species on this earth. And, in today's world, so basically, I mean, these are all historical things, right? Like from Marxism, where nature was conceived as something to exploit, versus today, we realize we are at the mercy of nature, really. We must behave ourselves, otherwise we'll be in trouble.
Now, we realize.
So basically, and so even this value of nature for itself is, a cultural ecosystem service, which we think of. We feel happier in green environments. There's a lot of data which also shows this behaviorally. So it is in today's world quantifiable in some way also. But I think that generally the ethos of considering ourselves part of nature and also dependent on it, realizing our dependence on it, not simply for exploiting it, is something which globally this transition is happening slowly. But how to bring that into policy in a country like India, where there are so many people and not so much of space? So that is the challenge, I think, which we all, I mean, I don't know, I wake up sometimes and I think, how is it even possible? Is it possible?
Possible. I stay awake thinking, how is it possible?
Yeah. But just also before just one more thing, that, this recently approved National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Wellbeing, one of the things we're really attempting to do there, is to actually quantify, what are pollination services, which we are actually getting for free, because most pollination in India is by wild insects, or hydrology, as well as carbon. I mean, we don't have these numbers for India, right? So while there are some global like extrapolations, we do not really have those hard numbers in India. And I think it's critical for us to have those hard numbers, to be at the bargaining table and to talk about the value of nature. I mean, I know there are two ways about it. You could say, why should we quantify something? It should just be valuable. But I don't think that works anymore. We do have to quantify it. And maybe, we're scared to quantify it, but we have to confront this question with data.
So, I mean, besides quantification, and something that you mentioned earlier on, and in order to get people to, I guess, appreciate and live better with nature, we have to raise awareness. And I know that's something you're very interested in from a communication standpoint. So there's a couple of questions. One has actually been raised in the Q&A today. There's also a question from Dr. Arunachalam, who is the Assistant Director General to ICAR, and he wants to know how do we start reaching out to the masses about the concept of coexistence? How do we do this? And a kind of a related question is, how do we discuss things like the nuanced situation about protected areas with the general public? So they're a little bit related, right? About how do we really bring conservation? And Prerna, as somebody who's written books and so many articles on this, I'd actually like you to comment on this as well.
Sorry, I didn't get the second bit. What about protected areas?
How do we bring the Q&A question is, how can we discuss the nuanced situation about protected areas effectively with the general public? So I'd like both of you to really comment on that.
So Uma has, yeah, Uma has been talking about the importance of communication, and I cannot emphasize it enough because, you know, communication is always an afterthought. Not in most organizations with most work that goes on, and unless we communicate, nuances of protected areas, coexistence, these are difficult concepts, right? Like I remember, and not just this, you know, when you talk about like climate change, climate crisis, sixth extinction, it all sounds very gloom and doom. I remember Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Dearrangement. He wrote, I would like to thank my sons for, you know, sitting and at the dinner table while the conversation was all about this huge crisis that is upon us. And I kind of feel like that many times. But I think there are two things to it. A, that you kindle that love for nature, that you kindle curiosity, kindle wonder, you know, that sense of wonder, that only then will people care. So the one is the knowledge and the wonder, and the other is, then the next step is that, so anybody who asks me, what can I do? That's a perennial question. What can I do as a single person? We're all single persons, right? We just started. But I think empowerment, empowering yourself with knowledge, and we as a communicator, so when I wrote The Vanishing or any of my books that I've written, it's always been, I want the average person to read it. It has to talk to the heart, you know, it has to be, so, and something as nuanced as the problems in protected areas or coexistence, you have to break it down. It has to come down to one case study, one story, and then you talk about the global picture. You have to, so if you're talking about, you know, man-animal conflict and the problems, take them to say Assam where 6 elephants were poisoned and 10 people have been killed by elephants or some such, and tell the story of the elephants and the people. You know, that is what touches people's hearts, and speak to them. Don't, you know, we can't speak from there, I think, and use all kinds of media. I'm still grappling with, I do manage social media, but I still grapple with some of it. But we have to be here, you know, to reach all kinds of people, right? You have to do print media, you have to do one-to-one, and I love doing that. You have to do social media, you have to, so just about go out there. And I think there are many people who respond, and that's usually encouraging. Yeah.
It's a fantastic response. I have to say that, you know, we recently did our interviews for our master's program in wildlife biology and conservation, and
I lost you.
Most of the students said that they were inspired. Like a great example, and I totally agree that, I mean, just as a communicator, using a hook, any hook, to get people interested in the story is the first thing, right? So if you're talking about grasslands, man, maybe it sounds so boring, but if you talk about the bustard and how it's going extinct, and why is it going extinct in spite of the fact that we have protected areas, you know, because the habitat it lives in, and tell the story of that habitat through the bustard or something like that. Basically, just as Prerna is saying, using case studies which are hooks, and then trying to get people to grapple with these complex concepts. And I think that, I think that, well, I mean, I don't know, but I feel that sometimes with bureaucrats, this is what is hard, because with the environment, there's nothing that is simple. It's not simple, it's complex, and there's no fix it, right? And that is something which, at least maybe I'm misinterpreting, but I feel sometimes that in communication with bureaucrats, that becomes difficult when talking about the environment. But I think with the common public, I think it's a really good platform. Actually, it's very easy to talk to people about the environment compared to something else. And also, I think that maybe going forward, there should be a larger role for citizen groups or mixed stakeholder groups. Like we have this very small effort, which NCBS is involved in, called the Bangalore Sustainability Forum, where there's, citizens, NGOs, companies, academia from Bangalore who care about Bangalore and its sustainability, right? So maybe efforts like that, where different kinds of people, and then they can do something in their lake, and they can get advice, they can get how to do this. I mean, it could be, because I think that citizen-led efforts are going to be very important in India in the future. We cannot expect the government to do everything for us, and it's just not going to happen. But we face a lot of challenges every day, right? So
Prerna, before you answer, because this is actually, Uma just brought this up. This is actually a question we had from our Q&A, is about engaging with policymakers, and how do we go about doing that? I mean, the specific question is: the public hearing and engaging with the public by policymakers a thing of the past? And is it set up currently? And you know, can you comment on that regarding what Uma was just saying about how difficult it is to talk with bureaucrats?
Who do you want to, should I go ahead? Prerna, okay. So just wanted to say before that, you know, just taking off from what Uma said, and I'll just get to it. So, you know, some of the issues currently, we've had such amazing communication. So there is that mining in Bheg Patkai Biosphere Reserve in Assam. And we have had everyone from, and so many others, you know, besides the media, you know, a rapper coming up with a song, and, you know, amazing song. So we have amazing ways to communicate, and the common citizen is actually coming forward to, so that's very heartening. How to communicate with policymakers? I mean, I've been doing it, and there is no one silver bullet, nor there is a quick success formula, but I find many policymakers are actually very receptive. And it is an exercise of figuring out, you know, and your instincts tell you, because you communicate, you meet with them, you talk to them, you know whose interest is what. And it's over time that, you know, as a journalist, that is what one did, and as a conservationist, even more so. You find that while there are limitations within which a policymaker works, there is a lot that they do, which we don't know of, to actually and our goals are shared goals in many ways. And you figure out whom to speak to, how to, and so there's a spectrum. There is individual, what you say over chai kind of talks, where and there is, then you petition them, you write to them formal letters, you follow it up, you reach, then, you know, you might get the media to write. So it's in one sense an advocacy in many ways, and you're right, you know, for them to communicate, they again are limited, and it's a complex issue. So at times I find that we become, you know, I wouldn't say their mouthpiece, but you communicate what they would like to see, and engage with governments at all levels. Don't always think the Ministry of Environment and Forests. You know, there is the local politicians, there's the local media, there is the Gram Sabha, there is MLAs, MPs, the state government, bureaucrats, not just forest officials, commissioners, secretaries, environment secretary, the CM's office, you know. I mean, I can go endlessly, and there's nothing to stop you. I mean, you have all the tools with you. But please be very sure when you reach out that you know your subject, that you're ready for every answer, that you know what you want from them, that you don't go with waste 30 minutes, you just go on and on quick. I think that's very, very important, that what do you need from them, and you're very clued into your subject. Be passionate, but be very strong on your knowledge and crisp. I don't know. I think I've been giving a lesson. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. So just before we get to the rest of the Q&As that have come up, because there's a couple of ones that I think I was expecting to get, actually. There's a question that we've been getting a lot, actually, for all our sessions and even on social media. And it's kind of about this single-use waste disposal. So I just want to bring it up because I have also been asked this so many times. Mayank Munjal has actually asked this. So how do we deal with the increasing single-use waste disposal that's being done right now during this pandemic? You know, everything from masks to PPEs to face shields, they're all being, you know, used and then thrown away. And of course, you know, with this instance, this is something because we were completely not prepared for a pandemic anywhere in the world. So we just had to scramble to try to get this together. But I mean, this idea of single-use waste is actually a much bigger issue that goes way beyond this current crisis. So maybe if you could just give a couple of quick comments on that, because it's an issue that's been brought up a lot.
Would you like to take this, Ms? Then I'll
You want me to go first? Go ahead. Yeah, Prerna, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, so just, I mean, we are reeling under plastic waste, and we do not really want to create one more problem, right? We already have the pandemic, which is, and we are by the single-use gloves and masks, and I mean, by 2050, the seas will have more fish. More plastic than more fish, right? That is by the World Economic Forum, that the seas will have more plastic than fish. And with this pandemic, which has just escalated this by many times, by 300 times in some areas. And I think, again, it's just that we, A, individually, but B, policy level. Please, no, not single use. Why can't we have reusable when we know they are, and why not wash your hands? I think it's a huge problem. We are not equipped to deal with it. We can't even handle the trash we have right now. It's a long story. And besides, it's medical waste, right? It's a question of health of the people who deal with such waste. And we have children who are in you know, landfills. So it's the same answer that would go for any single-use plastic. Please, not single-use. Reusable when there are alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a valid point, and it's something that you know, I have to admit that, you know, my lab does lab work, right? So we do use single-use gloves, and it is something which we think about a lot. I know that there are several you know, kind of movements even within academia and lab scientists to think about how we can reduce those kinds of waste. And I think maybe we should all, it's also about thinking about these things, right? So I think many times it's just like when you buy food, it often doesn't say where it's from. Of course, you'd like to buy something local, but you don't know, so you just buy whatever is there. So it would be good to have more information on these things. You know, where is this coming from? Where is it going to go? And then when you make a choice, maybe you will also make a more informed choice. Sometimes we expect everyone to make the right choice, but maybe people aren't confronted with those choices really in their face enough. And maybe they would make more informed decisions if they had more information.
Okay, so I'd like to jump to a couple of the Q&A questions that we've been asked, and I'm sure you probably expected to get asked a question about the EIA because it's such a big issue right now. And so there's two related questions. I'm just going to read them out. Paramjit Singh says, what will the consequences of the new EIA proposed by the MOEFCC on forests in general and conservation in particular be in India? And Vijay Dharmamoni said that the draft is facing strong opposition from environmental activists, industrialists, and job providers, approves it. And as we cannot completely avoid developmental activities, how can we bring a practically balanced efficiency and fairness into it? So kind of just maybe to comment, I think we would be remiss to at least not mention it during this conversation, considering it's so much in the public conscience right now.
I'll let Prerna go for that.
Okay, Uma. So I and a colleague, Vaishali Rawat, we have co-authored a letter which we've written to the MOEFCC, and we, about 110 people have signed it, including conservationists, former officers, people on various committees. And it's quite a detailed letter, and we have made it available in 10 to 12 regional languages so that people understand the impacts, etc. So the problem with it is, and I won't go into the fact that we are in an environment crisis. So we cannot have anything that dilutes the process of what polluting projects, etc. do. And what is the basic problem with this is that it fundamentally changes the character of the environment impact assessment from protecting the environment to essentially facilitating or allowing pollution and other environmentally damaging things to facilitate perhaps ease of business or and it does so by reducing the scope and undermining public hearing of projects of certain industries are now in categories which do not need a public hearing, do not need a appraisal of the environment impact. It just does away with the environment impact. And if you're a violating industry, you can just you can just pay a small fine and continue to operate. So it normalizes and regularizes violations. And these are just some of the and these include potentially very polluting industries such as cement and infrastructure, highways. And of course, wildlife is nowhere in the picture. So a lot of our wildlife is also going to be hugely impacted, because wildlife outside protected areas even more so, because there is nowhere in the assessment process anything about, looking at wildlife issues, etc. And this one is going to fundamentally, take away essentially the environment impact process of industries. And that, I think, is very, very worrying. It will have disastrous impact on her, and it needs to go. It needs to be scrapped. And we need to strengthen and simplify the existing one. Because again, as I say, unless we have a clean, it's good for business, a good, safe, clean environment is good for business. And we are seeing what has happened in Bagjan. The fire blowout is continuing 1 month on, more than a month on. And there was no public hearing. They shirked, they did away with a lot of, including a wildlife clearance, which we pointed out. They continued with work. So we are seeing the impacts of what happens when an environment impact assessment is not done judiciously. In Vizag, we saw people died and people are suffering. So, the impacts on our peoples, forget wildlife for a moment or environment. It's our peoples who are suffering. Right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's great, Prerna. I just would like to add that I think that the whole environmental impact assessment should be a bit more scientific versus just descriptive. It's become like, you read them, they're like theses, like huge documents. And I think there should be, alternative scenario, evaluation, stakeholder consultation. It should be much more participatory and quantitative and easy to, basically should be scientific also versus just, it's become like a niche which some companies or whatever occupy, and that needs to also change, I feel.
To be unbiased, simpler, and yes, very much science driven.
Yeah. So, and basically this scenario, consider alternate scenarios, because there may be ways to avoid what you are proposing, but still get the same benefits. So why not explore that before? Because unfortunately, the way, Prerna's much more experienced in these matters, but it could be the way all of this functions. Like if it's a road, the contract is already out for the road, and that's when you're evaluating where, what the effect of the road is going to be. But why not have, where the road is going to be evaluated before you put out the contract for the road? Because then it's a no-win situation. You can't change the road because there's already somebody ready to build the road and they're already losing money and so on and so forth. But if you started out by saying, where should this road be and how could it be such that everyone benefits from it? That would be a much better, possibility. Does it need to be there? And if so, what is the best configuration to benefit everyone? If possible, if there are trade-offs, what are they and how should they be addressed?
So another aspect of environmental impact is actually the benefits of our ecosystems, right? And it's something I know, Uma, that you're very keen on as part of the biodiversity mission, ecosystem services. And there's an interesting question that was raised about the concept of payment of ecosystem services. And we have an example of China, who has implemented the gross ecosystem product of one of the provinces. And I think we usually think about our impact on the environment rather than also that the environment is constantly giving to us in very tangible and bioeconomic, quantifiable ways. So I was wondering if you might comment on that, because I know that's something particularly that you've been working on for the mission perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, this is really something I probably should not, there's many people who are better equipped to answer this question. But I think whenever we're talking about payment, we have to be careful because it can always backfire. We've seen this even in the context of human-wildlife conflict and many things. So I think it's something which will have to be probably local, local solutions depending on the region or the area. But yes, it is something which we should consider. But then who's going to pay is the question, right? I mean, if the government has, I don't know how much money there is in the government right now, but who's going to pay for these things is something which we need to think about. And models like restoration, where there are services which people get. I mean, everything can also not be cash based. I feel like India is. I don't know. I'm not an economist at all, so this is really not my expertise. But maybe strengthening rural economies not based only on cash would be a way for a somewhat of a way forward. But yeah, payment for services, especially in the context of companies, maybe something we must consider. How much to do it carte blanche, I'm not sure about. Prerna, maybe you can comment on that.
Good. I think, no, I think, I mean, I agree. I mean, how do you, I mean, that's payment. What is the value? I mean, I'm very dubious about this because of the whole thing on forest, right? When you cut a forest, you compensate. What is it, Uma? The net worth. Campa, because so when you cut a forest, the company deposits a certain amount as whatever is calculated as the value of the forest, and it's done. So how do you put a value? Who pays? What is the value? And you're right, not everything is cash based. So again, I think I'm just going to be saying what Uma has already said, because it has to be. Yeah, we need to be very careful on this one. So I don't think
using it to sustain rural economies and people who depend on nature very strongly, I think might be an interesting tool to explore and to think about, but also in the context of things like restoration and so on. So I don't know. I mean, we haven't explored these models, so we would really need to maybe have some pilot studies or pilot.
It is. In Maharashtra, they are doing. So there are, I think they have started where the rural, the people living in buffer areas are actually getting money for letting the animals eat their crops. So they are getting, certain priorities in things like toilets and things like getting gas connections. So there are models like you say, so, and that is what we need to explore much more so that again our people benefit.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I would love to talk a lot longer, but we have run out of time. But I want to thank you both so much. Your insights were really wonderful and very thought-provoking, and actually give us a lot of things to take our conversations forward on how we can really start thinking about incorporating science in a different way in our societies, and especially in terms of keeping our nature and the beautiful nature that we have here. So I hope that everybody in the audience will also join us next week, where we have a conversation on our health systems to close out this this session. And thank you, Prerna, so much. Thank you, Uma, so much. It's always a joy and a pleasure, and I'm really honored to have you both participate in this. So thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, and thanks a lot. Bye-bye. See you. Bye.
Bye.